We're here. This is part of the new SOC on the Block series. We are talking about just having a regular old SOC versus adding red team activities with the potential to talk about some purple action too later on. Your tour guide through this with our collection of just about everybody on this call has worked in a SOC or on a red team or in a penetration test team. And we're here to give you our at least particular experiences and views on the topic of how we built it, how we set up, how we get going, and most importantly, why and how you get money. Next slide, please. The problem is ongoing and everybody has it. Why have both is always important. We're just monitoring all the time. That's all you need. We're going to give you some attributes where you can start and then get a little bit more loose and talk about red team and purple team engagements and some example scenarios we've all been on. Next slide, please. Insider threats are real to all of us, and how you discover them is definitely up to you in your own way, but everybody has layoffs. We're down here in the Silicon Valley. We all know about RIFs, reduction in forces, but you have new hires, which is a particularly vulnerable time in your organization. There's mergers and acquisitions. I was sent over to Europe once with Arla Foods had bought 25 other small organizations and dairies and everybody who had 3 or 4 servers and this and that, and how do they put it all together? And then again, there's bribery and disgruntlement. Anybody on this call has a price for giving up our corporate credentials. Mine for $3 million, you can have my logins. But if you have somebody that you've just hired and they're straight out of college and 10,000 would make a difference, Lapsus, as we know, has discovered that they could buy things for $10,000. Next slide, please. So why have a SOC and a red team? Well, the reality is the SOC and the insider threats are both trying to collect the right data. Insider threat teams have to know what they're looking for. Red team events, while important drills for how to respond, can be buried in noise. And it is a loss of, how do we say, confidence if your SOC does not discover your red team activity. And if they're just doing it manually every single time, each individual person, we're all 5 supportive, loving people on this call, but we would all do it 5 different ways with different outcomes if left to our own devices. Next. So security operations by SANS, we won't linger here too long. It's the combination of people, process, and technologies that are protecting your systems through monitoring current state, trying to detect things as they happen, escalating, and minimizing damage. Let's move to the next one. When I went out there and started looking and saying, what is a red team mission focus? It was much harder to find something that was easily defined. So I put this one together to throw out there to think about a demonstration of how real-world attackers can combine seemingly unrelated exploits each time to continue their goals. So a red team's mission is to continually increase resilience. So running scenarios from a hostile perspective helps find, hey, I didn't realize that was vulnerable. And the simu-live conditions, you can say, well, we trained on that 6 months ago. How many of you remember that training you had 6 months ago on what you do if you get the wrong thing happens, or something is weird, or your Zoom just doesn't open at all that morning? Each of those might have a different set of what you're doing for security events. And you've done your education, but it's hard. Red teams keep you live, keep you focused, and continually help you increase that resistance. Next. So 4 attributes of a successful program. This is for red teams or insider threats are as follows. We've all been placed the bad guys. Your red team needs to be able to assume that there's an insider in your network right now. Assume that you're in a breach state right now. Assume that something happened 3 weeks ago before we got your tools. You need to know what normal looks like. What does Jeannie do normally? What does Steve do normally? What does Eli do normally? All of these things are important. You need to embrace some automation to make sure that as much as you can automate things you can, because again, we're all 4 humans. And we think like insiders and business execs. So I want to pause here and go around the horn and say, my experience as being a global SOC manager and hiring people to do all of this for me. Jason, tell me about your SOC and red team experience.
So like all companies, there is a budget constraint. So we didn't officially have a red team at Verizon, in our telematics side. So as a manager, and having be fortunate to have a larger SOC, I did push our SOC analysts to do some red teaming at night or shifts that, just were very slow. That was our extent to build out the red team, to help us find stuff that we just aren't monitoring. Um, Especially since our side was basically handling a lot of IoT. So it was very niche setup. So red team back then was very little to find stuff in IoT, such as a car, pen testing and whatnot. So that's my extent on red teaming.
Yeah. Mike, what you got?
So I was fortunate enough to be at a corporation where, we had a lot of funding in our security department. So red teaming for us was a continuous process over many months with a third party as they tested every single nook and cranny that we had in our organization. And with every single hole that they found, uh, our team was very receptive to that and worked hard to make the changes, to patch those holes as they came up. Uh, so that the biggest thing to me was that continuous process that we had in place, where we met on a regular cadence with uh, the people performing the red team assessments and making changes as we went.
Eli, how'd this go on your team?
Hey, good morning. So I was a SOC manager for defense and government, and security, like Michael was saying, was more of a continuous process for us. We tied it all to NIST 853. So that made it easier whenever, it came time to asking for more funds. But we would have to have independent assessments, which was red teams, come and test out the viability and the security of our technical measures, technical and our processes as well.
Steve, how are you on the red and purple teaming?
Thanks, Jeannie. Yeah, I'm probably a little bit of the exception to the rule here in terms of SOC experience. The scope of my SOC experience has been, I think I spent a day in one, kind of just walking around, learning what they do, seeing the operations. Certainly for me, I'm more on the flip side. I've definitely been involved with or run some red teams in the past, but my experience is much more on the offensive research side, which is obviously tangential to this, but very similar as well, where you're looking at highly specific vulnerabilities, individual exploits, you're crafting end-to-end attack simulations or scenarios for a specific device, software, network target, and then carrying that through to completion. Whereas obviously a red or purple team, typically on the red team side, you're looking more holistically. You're just generally trying to achieve some kind of a breach condition, and it's an ongoing exercise. So a little bit of a different, little bit of a different aperture to this, but I think you were talking about how important a red team, purple team, blue team are within an organization. I would add to that a good research team that can do internal testing in very specific exploitation scenarios is equally important as well. So not that I'm biased at all.
In case anybody was wondering what Steve runs within our organization. John.
I'm John, and my experience between SOC and Red Team, I'm kind of like Steve. I don't have any SOC experience. I spent the bulk of my career doing red teaming. And you had mentioned the mission statement. We always thought of ourselves as like an educational tool, where we would know the threat, teach the threat, and then replicate it. That way we could better prepare the blue team when the real thing came knocking. And so I did that primarily. I would help plan with our customers' events and then operate them, and obviously deliver after action reports and things like that. So
Exactly. Well, let's go in this now that we've started saying, here's where we're thinking, here's what we're doing, and here's the perspectives. Let's dig on deeply. Tam, next, please. Where to begin? This one is fun one, saying that the first one, if you don't have a red team now, if you are introducing something new in your organization, Well, we all need money, and defining stakeholders. By money, it's not just that. It means that money is that if I was going to say, Steve, I need you to take over a red team. John, I need you to build a red team. He needs to say, well, do I get a human? Humans cost money. Do I have tools? Tools can cost money. What are the log sources that I need to both see what's going on in the organization, and what are the tools that they might need to purchase in order to not cause a mess? We don't necessarily want to be downloading all our tools on the dark web. We also need to figure out, this one is the most important thing for me, is what is the business critical use cases? And I say by asking, what would keep us in business? What keeps us out of business? We all know scenarios, hospitals shut down if they can't give medication, if their IoT system is down, if their medical dispensary system is down, if their PHI system is down. Each of those can take a hospital out. If I run an MMORPG, I need to have my games up and have constantly being able to have 1 million people logged into my servers. So how do you get things to ask? And the last one I think is going to be even most important. So Steve and John, I'll get you to talk about this a lot, of communicating the business value you're driving back upwards, because the biggest thing is somebody paid for you. How do you show them what your money bought, how you've made the life better, and how you've made things more secure? So next slide. Pain should be distributed. I truly believe that you can go to different departments cap in hand and say, hey, there's not just IT and information security, there's your chief financial officer. Somewhere somebody has a risk register. So motivation, is there a pet project? Can you get a budget for at least your time and energy? Get some people to buy in. Is there a zero trust architecture mandate? Or if your financial organization is at fraud, privacy, or data security? Pain and cost related to a breach. So for those of you that have run red teams, do you want to weigh in here of saying, where did you get funding? Did you ever have to go out for more? How did you do it? Steve, did you ever have to go get your own funds, or was it always set up for you?
Yeah, a good question. I've only really had to get what I would call significant budget once for red teaming. We generally had allocated budget for it. It wasn't extensive, and my experience again is much more on the research side. So I will say I've had to do it once. It was a semi-painful process, but also allocated. So I was probably lucky in that regard. On the running the research side of things, as you can imagine, that's one of the most difficult areas to raise money and to project a cost benefit analysis and all of that stuff, because you're an indefinite cost center. You don't make a dime of direct revenue. So everything you do is dotted line. It's thought leadership. It's brand value to the organization. It's eyes on the work that you're doing and projecting the brand. And a lot of it is really just comes down to whether you have a C staff that is supportive of the idea that a security company damn well better knows security, right? And a good research team is one of the biggest parts of that. We have the same thing with an Exabeam, where we're lucky to have a leadership that understands that a security research team is essential to the identity and the fabric of a strong security company. And those that don't have it, you generally can tend to tell very quickly that their security expertise and depth of knowledge is low. So building the budget or determining a budget for this area is maybe harder than anything else. And a lot of the times it's connecting those dotted lines that aren't obvious from the surface level.
John, how did you justify your budget? I mean, you're right. You said it, the magic words are kind of cost recovery center, aren't they? So
I didn't really deal with the budget just due to the nature of our red team. We had a lot of different customers that would come to us because they had a mandate or need for a red team. And so honestly, we tended to have more work than time. So
also happens. Let's go to the next slide, please. I'm going to stay with you for just a minute. So you had an executive buy-in is the most important thing in here. There's somewhere who has some authority over money or budget that could say, yeah, we need you. Is there anything that we missed here under executive needs of, like, naturally they want to see everything with authentication and authorization, compliance documentation, and then fast notification. Is there any other pieces that they really gave you as this is your mandate, this is their needs to report back?
We did have a great question come in from Chris.
Oh,
Um,
you
want to know if we could
talk through the
talk?
cost benefits of developing an internal red team versus outsourcing. Absolutely. Anytime you're going to pay for something on the outside, you're going to get what they want, and what their package looks like is the really big thing. So you can also say, if I pay for it, a red team, that's kind of like paying for a pen test. You can do that once, but if you're going to do it regularly on a regular basis, you need to start saying, well, how much does it cost? If I was going to have on a team Eli and John doing this, that's 2 FTE. I say, okay, I know how much they are going to cost me in the Silicon Valley here. They're expensive, but it's worthwhile. And I get their time all the time with any project I want, versus if I have somebody else doing a red team engagement, it might be just for a weekend, but is it continuous? Is it regular? What do I need? Are they part of my staff helping out, or are they just, does it become a us versus them organization? There can be a lot of different, both organizational and hidden costs in trying to hire somebody that's doing it on a regular basis versus hiring somebody, at least internally, to manage it and set it and go. At least that's my thought. Mike, do you have any other thoughts on hiring somebody versus development?
Yeah, so I mean, it ultimately comes down to, what can your organization sustain and how much do you want to invest into it? So if you have been, in my opinion, if you've been running, red team engagements with a third party for a few years now, and you're at the point where you're ready to develop your own processes, you're ready to kind of graduate, you've learned all you can from this third party. You've kind of gotten your full value out of your engagement with them. I would say, yeah, it would make sense to move on and start making your own in-house programs, processes, things to follow. I would say that for anybody getting started, going the third party route, somebody who has the experience across a wide range of organizations makes the most sense at, designing your own program, getting an idea of what you want.
Steve, did you have
Yeah,
something?
no, I was just going to add, sorry, I'm a little bit of an audio delay, I think, here at home. I was just going to add, I think there's pros and cons to both internal and outside sourcing of a red team or pen test. Typically, the motivation you don't have to worry about for outsourced pen tests. They're only going to generate new contracts if they're successful and if they're showing detailed reports, and you really get what you pay for. So that's pretty straightforward. On the internal red team, sometimes the motivation is job retainment, salary, all of that kind of stuff that you don't necessarily have to think about. So you have to find different ways to motivate internally. The other thing that I've seen for internal pen test teams is, despite the fact that you might not think that there's an insider element to it and you're treating them as a fully autonomous unit in a black box, it doesn't always work exactly that way. They know people, they know things about the system, they understand the network architecture, they know what type of systems are deployed internally, generally speaking. So there is sometimes a little bit of an element of that insider bias for a internal red team that you don't always have with an external one. So there's a lot of different things to consider, I think, depending on what your objectives are with the pen test and whether you want to go in blind or with some kind of predetermined knowledge about it. But both can be good options either way.
Hey, Jenny, I can follow up with that too. Also, if you look at security, we're not making the company any money. So when they try to invest in employees, it's hard to push for a red team. I know at Verizon, when we ever had an MMA, we'd always force, from a management point of view, a budget for a red team. And it goes back to what Steve just said, is you think that security group would have a different mindset, right? They're red teaming their own software and all the environments, but they might miss something because it's been there for 20 years and just not notice it because it's just been sitting right in front of them, right? And then you get an open mind from another outside source, and they find stuff like that, and potentially it could be critical, like your software that's sitting up in your data center unless you control your servers, right? It might be outbound and allowed open, and nobody really recognized it because they're using it every day and didn't think about it. Or a security tool like surveillance, it's wide open because they want to see the video feeds from outside. So it is always a benefit to always have an outsource. And that's how we haven't kind of managed that. Verizon is in our MMAs, we always force some sort of red teaming plus pen test.
Yeah, I think somewhere in there for a pen test, there's a reason that letters of attestation come from the outside of somebody looking in. I think the red team very much is the continuous improvement, the continuous internal push. So developing that mandate of continuous improvement, continuous internal is just as important, much in the way that a person can't test their own code. You really do need the outside verification now and again for, that maybe it's that annual pen test, maybe it's that annual check. So I guess there's an argument for both. But Chris, does that answer your question a little bit on the cost benefits of internal versus outsourcing? I hate that it's always the answer is it depends, but you guys have excellent points on that. Let's move on. Perfect. There's a lot of pieces that even now SOCs are dealing with, like in the year 2001, just showing you how old I was, we looked at HIDs, NIDs, and firewalls. Now there's a lot more interesting things to be tested. So there's a lot of log sources that they can see. What is your coverage? What are you going to look at? Here's where you start drawing up your mission statement, as it were. You've got your mission statement, but you say, what are you going to test every time? What can a valid user do? What can a not valid user do? How can a new user do? These are all interesting areas of looking at. And I kind of grouped them. There's argument that I had with my buddy Andy saying what falls under what in this area, but for data and access management, for local cloud, there's a lot more interesting things to test, which also makes a little bit more of the argument for having a internal red team discipline, even if it's not somebody's primary function. I mean, Jason, you and I are both kind of sock monkeys in our own way. So we have a little bit of somebody was always testing us in one way. We had customers testing us, and by customers, it could be stakeholders from different areas. But at the same time, there's data that sometimes you need to find out after every red test and say, we could have seen this faster if we had seen X, right?
Yeah, I can give an example of what we had a problem with. As everybody knows, any cell phone company had SIM card cloning back in the day, and it became very relevant that your employees were going behind security and cloning stuff, getting paid and all that. From the Verizon telematics side, one of the things during the time I started was the whole Jeep attack, right? That was definitely an issue, but from what we figured out too is your insider threats. With the capability with Verizon, we were able to unlock cars, open windows, do certain tasks, right? And it kind of matched what the SIM card cloning was a problem, right? With somebody opening cars and letting them steal out of them. From an insider threat, that was definitely a concern. And as you can see, none of that would be in these log sources from any kind of red teaming or pen test. So we definitely had to adapt and understand and write code to get that proprietary software logs out of there to be able to use it in eventually Exabeam, where we can do analytics and see, what's normal, what's not.
Well, remember some of the earliest things they had was, hacking CCTV cameras and hacking, the firmware of upgrades, et cetera. There's still some new things under the sun out there, especially with the hacking of IoT devices. And the truth is, SOCs can't see everything yet. So sometimes it's going to be maybe I don't have a full evidentiary chain of my first one, but starting a discipline and starting a methodology for what you're going to put together is going to matter. Say, if this is my log sources and this is what I can and can't do, then you're probably going to need to test the things that you don't have regular log sources for even more often. Next slide. This is sort of a recycled example that I have of saying, what is it work? So this works for an incident in the SOC, but it can also say, how am I going to set up What is my preparation to set up any of my scenarios? What am I test? What do I believe to be true, and what am I going to test that's going to true? So on this one, John, walk us through, as for instance, something that you might do as you were doing some prep work to say, I'm going to test a new area, a new development, a new piece of code, a new organization.
I mean, normally I would try to learn the basics of things. Like, I mean, for one example, is we were testing this proprietary network enclave type of thing. And, so they had been pretty good at stopping our red team. So I just, got friendly with everyone at the planning meeting. Like, how do you log into this? What are your alternate ways? And, just getting all this information. That way I could take it back to my red team and be like, oh, you should try to break it this way, So, I mean, a lot of it is just trying to find the most basic things that people don't think are that's just a normal part of their everyday operation, because there's a lot of times some weird way that maybe you can pour forward something and pretend to be someone else, or it's always like some little basic thing that you can exploit that no one even thought, but it's just normal. You're basically just a really bad sysadmin. um, but I mean, really, it's all about, I mean, you have to break everything down to a very basic level, and then see what you can abuse.
I'm going to jump on a piece of that just and say, I bet Jason can back me up on this. You can focus in on there in the social engineering part of it, of saying that, what do people do normally? What is their normal activity? Everybody knows that we all do this, and it's a completely secure building, except the door that all my smokers go out. And it seems that on my midnight shift, my entire SOC is made up of conspiracy theorists, gamers, sports lovers, and smokers that all have a need to every 2 hours go outside for 10 minutes. So that's something that I would know through my own recon and observation of that. Jason or Mike, do you have any other things that you've come out of that regularly of saying, just in terms of the social engineering aspect of this kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a little different now because, a lot of SOCs are at home compared to back in the day. But, a lot of our employees were e-cigarette people, and they would congregate in one area, and basically if you overheard them, you got a lot of details you can get out of them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, next slide. If you're out there, pretend to smoke, even if you don't, if you can take it. This is where we're going to go in a little bit more of the hypothetical. What's your checklist if you're going to start setting up a red team engagement? Eli, what you got?
So for us, kind of one of the overarching themes that I've heard throughout the webinar is, how do you get your red team in, or do you have your own red team versus hiring somebody out? And for us, we normally hired somebody out. It was a matter of requirement, either by regulation or something to that effect. And, my job as a SOC manager was to take that requirement and put it into some sort of value to convince somebody higher above me that, hey, we actually do need to go through this. Because being in defense, being in government, there's other things that all have priority. And, they always say, if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. So you got to find a way to kind of one up, the next guy so that you can get this through the door.
I have a question, Jeannie. So this goes to Eli too, and a few other guys. Working in multiple SOCs, how did your leadership manage these red teams alerts? I know in multiple SOCs, we recorded every IP that they were coming from, which kind of gave them away. I personally did not like that. At Verizon, I was the manager, I would not tell my SOC employees that this was happening. How did you guys handle that?
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you go, Eli, first.
No, I was just gonna say, I did it the exact same way as you, Jason. I wouldn't tell people that it was coming, but of course, I mean, that direction came from somebody higher than me. But I mean, I definitely agreed with it. I wanted to see exactly um, how efficient or how effective our processes were and how effective the tools were that we were using.
That was a big piece of it. We basically used to, IBM SOC, we treated every single incident as hostile. That was just a basic assumption that your SOC literally has to make, because if I'm assuming that, Steve on my team is running my red team, well, I happen to know that Steve's laptop is the one that we normally use for scanning. So if I just simply write a rule so that I don't have to see Steve's events anymore, what do I do if Steve loses his laptop? What do I do if something weird happens in there? So that's why we had to set it up of just assume hostile, assume everything. And we escalated anytime something happened. We had to set up that full escalation chain, because in the end, it wasn't just a test of the infrastructure. It was a test of our humans. It was a test of saying that, okay, Steve could reach out to me and say, Jeannie, that was me. I did that at this time. And then maybe my change ticket that I put in there, I might close out. But everything is the testing. It's not just the system. I have to test the people. Did they see? Did they respond properly? Did they respond in the amount of time that I've given them to respond? What does it do? Did everybody understand their role? What did the documentation at the end of it look like? Did Steve do something that was outside the bounds of his initial mission? I would live to find that thing, because frankly, that means that I get to wag my finger at Steve and say, hey, warn me next time, so that I don't have anybody waking me up at 2:00 in the morning. Steve, you may speak.
Yeah, thank you. Always concerned with which finger you're wagging at me, Jeannie, but we won't go down that road. I just wanted to add one thing, which was, you guys were talking, I think Jason and Eli, you guys were talking about what I would consider like a black box or a closed pen test, where the attacker really has no knowledge or no insight into the system. I think it's definitely the most effective way to holistically test an organization and find out, you're essentially simulating what would a real attacker do. The counterpoint to that, which is the clear box or transparent or white box testing, whatever you want to say there, has value as well. I think of that more as almost a targeted research project, where you're looking at a specific system, a component, a network asset, and your goal is not necessarily to find out, can the organization be breached, but is this target vulnerable? Is there a weakness here that we can exploit? And so having access to it, and maybe even source code or anything, allows you to much more quickly find the flaw when you don't really care about whether there's an entry point. You're just trying to find out if that system is weak or not. So to me, that's really the difference between the closed test and the open test. Each one has its value. Really depends on what the scope of the target is.
Exactly. Like a forensic investigation that go on. I got sent to Costa Rica to do one, and I came back and said, here's the 130 pages of my findings, which then got handed to the director of IT with the instruction, if she said it, make it real. So you find things accidentally in this too. For instance, as part of your pen test, you discover that, hey, this shift on the SOC shares a single SOC at organization login. Maybe a shared login isn't the good idea, and it actually is more secure now to work from home that I have a single one. So let's go to the next slide, Tim. I want to talk about purple teams here. So purple teams are a little bit of both red and blue at once. Eli, do you want to kick us off talking about purple team engagements and what they mean to you?
Purple team is more of a learning exercise. It's where, you do have a red team engagement, but it's kind of like left seat, right seat with the blue team. I've been a part of them more as a sysad and a tech, in the earlier days before it was really called red team. But we had a security team come out and test our defenses. And when they would get in, they'd say, hey, look, this is how I did it. And you go and you alter your process. This is back before change management. So if there's any change managers out there, don't, no nails on the chalkboard, but we would make the change on the fly and, fix it that way.
I had a question come in, and that since you're talking anyway, one is basically talked about tools and how do you get permission from IT to execute them? My initial instinct would be that's why you have the corporate, higher up sponsor. But did you ever have any challenge with somebody saying, "Hey, you're not allowed to test my new box. I just built it"?
All the time, because I mean, the sysadmin's like, hey, I'm not done with that or whatever. But yeah, anytime you want to bring a new tool onto the network, nowadays it's a lot more in-depth process where the tool has to undergo testing and, like to Steve's point, if you have access to the source code, even better, because those type of white box tests are actually really, really effective.
Yeah, I'm a also Singer believer in all the AppSec testing of test before it gets pushed into your final commit, guys. But
Oh yeah.
Mike, talk to us about how you determined scope and frequency. And unmute yourself.
Thanks. I found that the scope would morph with each engagement as we kind of took a more targeted approach where we would target specific clumps of assets or entities, if you will, depending on organization, what you have. And we would pivot around between all our different engagements. And really, it comes down to, as we talked about earlier, budget and just how much can you afford to in terms of both money and time to commit to writing these engagements, because it's not just paying for the people to do it or the third party to do it, but also the time invested from these people to analyze the findings, actually conduct the tests and whatnot. So like every other question today, it's going to depend,
Well, it brings up an interesting question of when you're hiring somebody to do it, you have to define their scope. You have to define their aims. You're almost doing all of the work that you would end up doing if you hadn't actually had some of, do that work yourself. I think we have a hand up there, Tam, if you want to. Charles?
Yep. Give me 1 second. I will get him unmuted.
Charles, do you have a question on this line?
All right. You're good, Charles.
Okay. I'm kind of finding this an interesting kind of discussion, but there's one thing that I need to find out how you guys do it. How am I able to speak the executive language with regards to how to report to the executive for them to get the buy-in of what I generally am doing? But my name is Charles Osebo, so I'm the SOC manager for Bank of Ghana. But once in a while, when we report this to the top executive, we have a kind of misgivings about the kind of report that we churn out. So I want to know, how do I be able to communicate to the top executive for them to understand? For us, budgeting is not a problem. It's a central bank, so it's not a problem. But communicating reports, what happened at the SOC, so that I'll not be some more technical, but more of executive kind of thing for manager to understand.
Excellent question. I would love to dive onto that one a little bit if I can. From the perspective of being that SOC manager, I need to be able to communicate that in multiple terms. If it is something that touches on HR, I need to say, hey, I need to be able to give you this is all that I know. These are what motives I can glean. UEBA tools tend to give you a little bit more of is it compromise versus is it intentional for problems that you have? So I say, what is the risk-based? I can map it back to something that is commonly held wider than my organization, like, hey, I've discovered a large gap within my MITRE framework. I had no visibility here. I had no visibility here. And what is the risk? Because when you're doing your risk analysis, I'm going to say this comes all the way back to good old project management. You say the risk if somebody compromised this system is I have a plastic injection system. If I am out for 24 hours, that costs me, $100,000. So if I am out for this many days, it costs me this many time per hour. It costs this. So you really do have to break it back down into the executive terms so that they understand the security terms. If you just say security terms, they're not going to understand it. You really have to break it down and say, this is my risk. This is my legal risk. This is my HR risk. This is my exposure. This is my potential damage. And this is what I could do with what Mike's team just did to us, discovering that, hey, we've tested a new system. If this rolls out, we could be on social media as the next big embarrassing company. We could win the Pony Awards for the stupidest thing that happened. What is the impact to that? So that's kind of the holistic view that I get on it, of just not saying, yes, it shut down and Eli wasn't able to do his job and Steve wasn't able to do his job. So I can give those of saying, I pay them this much an hour. I have this many hours where that many people were off work. I can say, if my IT team has to work 24/7, here is my cost to get that fixed. And the good news about this is you're not alone. You are not the first company that's ever been breached. I literally, when we had something coming back and saying, these are the findings, I spent some time on Google searching and just doing some basic searching on, if this happens, like, what is the amount of time for this type of breach? What is the average cost? You have Verizon did a data breach investigation report, kudos to them. IBM had an investigation thing, kudos to them. All of these, you can start getting cost and monetary things to communicate based on that.
Can I add in there, Jeannie, too?
Yeah.
So, like she said, handing reports over to executives is not easy, trust me. What I've done in the past is actually do tabletops, just like you do a tabletop with your SOC, right? Doing a tabletop with your executives was eye-opening. And the way we framed it is just like a report. You got your tabletop and post it in the company name into CNN page or whatever. And they started seeing what could happen at the end, right? And showing how much this company lost from a breach from this type of vulnerability, or your red team that found these, stuff that's open. And that was eye-opening for them. Unfortunately, they didn't take the changes on their site and they got breached. So it, like we said, it's hard. It's not easy. Just keep up the fight, man.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm grateful. I appreciate that.
There was an instance that we had recently with a company that will not be named, that we discovered they had a DLP system up. And as we were doing the view there, we found that through their DLP system with a combination of our behavioral analysis, we discovered that one of their employees was starting to talk about and send notes about ideating self-harm. So what is the advantage of saving a human life? What is the advantage of, if somebody is manufacturing cars, they'll tell you that, Jeannie, if a robot kills a human on my floor, I'm out of business. Robots as a service is done. Each of these, when you find out what the pain point is, becomes easier to communicate upward. Sometimes it's just money, sometimes it's humanity. But the cost of a breach is always a good place to start, especially if you say, for these particular areas, what is our core business? What do we, if we can't do our core business for how much time, that helps them understand what is the impact, what is the risk, what is the probability. And then you say, how long did it take to respond? I'm going to kind of answer this question that came up on KPIs. How quickly did somebody say, hey, why is Steve Povolny's, computer doing weird things? Okay, we got this and we saw this and we called Steve 20 minutes later. I'm like, hey, I have a 20-minute response. That's actually not bad. It'd be better if there was automation within my system to stop Steve's system from doing what it's doing now. But each of those ways, I can start saying, that's what it takes now. And then I have John running something for me in 3 months from now, and maybe he sees it within 15 minutes. That is a KPI. I've got improvement. So I am measuring my systems. I'm measuring my humans. I'm measuring my processes and procedures. And I start putting that out. Anybody else have any other idea on KPIs that they
Yeah,
want to talk about?
I mean, same thing with Verizon. We just talked about cloning SIM cards, right? Once we had processes in place and security was monitoring certain tasks, that was definitely a KPI. We saw a decrease in clones. It's still out there, there's still a capability, but we definitely saw and use that to leverage, hey, well, security being able to do these kind of red teamings and SOC watching them, we saw a dramatic decrease of that.
And there's a question out there saying, do you share your red team, purple team results with your MSSP to ensure relevant rules and findings are implemented? Well, you can. I actually recommend doing it. The question is, did your MSSP find it or did they not find it? I think it's, if they didn't find it, I would pause for a moment and say, what logs am I sending my MSSP? If I have something that says, well, I don't want to give them my Active Directory logs, and it was something I discovered at the Active Directory, that one's not really their fault now, is it? So you have an opportunity to really say, what do I have on which systems? Is it something that I want them to measure more for me in the future? And this can also be if I'm building my case of saying, oh, look, I'm sending them X data. They have this many terabytes of data a year. If I also send them this, this, and this, they will discover the red team faster, but it's going to have my cost. So that's where you start. Honestly, you have to build your numbers and put them on a spreadsheet and give them to your financial team to say, yes, we want our MSSP to monitor this thing that we haven't monitored before and logged. That's why we kind of gave you that whole list of, here's all of the logs out there. Somewhere there might be a log to the system that helps. What is the financial gain risk of not providing your teams with those logs? Yeah. All right, where are we going next, Tam? Ooh, let's go for some example scenarios. Steve, if you wouldn't mind, walk us through some idea of, these are basically an unauthorized access from somebody on the outside, right? There's not just, there's the easy way, get Jeannie, give her $3 million, you own her credentials and you're in. How would you start of saying that, all right, I want to see if I can do this without giving anybody any money as a bad guy? What's your favorite tool gathering?
Yeah, this is the $1 million question. There's so many unique ways in. I think, I forget who it was earlier that mentioned, maybe Jason was talking about social engineering and the human element. Depending on your comfort level with who the attacker is, this can be a really hard skill set or a really easy skill set. A lot of really powerful organizations will hire or build a expertise in social engineering because there can be language barriers, there can be technical and written barriers, there can be comfort with people, and all of those things are important for social engineering. I will say that from my perspective and experience, this is generally going to be the easiest way in. All other things, that we talked about earlier, disregarded there. So if you can find somebody who can effectively social engineer, to me, that's really just kind of a matter of time and effort. And a lot of the major attacks we've seen in the last 5 years come from a compromised credential, from stolen account or social engineered phishing, which counts to me as well. So a lot of simple ways in from the outside that I think are overlooked, and that's a really tough one to fix. On the more complex side, I think you have obviously things like original zero-day vulnerabilities or even end-day vulnerabilities that haven't been fixed, which tend to be the first entry point into a network outside of a social engineering. You have still today a lot of the simple stuff like configuration issues where a service account is not properly configured with the right credentials or ACLs, or you have a network setting that's not properly restricting and is unknown about, or you have a system that's internet facing, an IoT system, for example, that shouldn't be and has no business being on the internet. So unfortunately, this is a million-headed beast here in terms of the original entry point. I think one of the things to call out here is my whole career was based off of that entry point, finding a network accessible way to breach a network, breach an organization. And while I still believe the value of identifying that is crucial, after coming to Exabeam, it really kind of opened my eyes in terms of how important the full attack chain is in terms of being able to detect at some point. You may not necessarily need to be able to understand what that entry point is or that unauthorized access, because there will always be some series of steps afterwards, whether it's lateral movement, whether it's another compromised credential, whether it's a first time a host reaches outbound, data exfiltration, all of those steps. If you can identify any one of them, and the more the better, you have an opportunity to disrupt the entire kill chain. So I'm not sure if that answered the question exactly, but just kind of my initial kind of ponderings on this.
No, I love it. That's exactly kind of the direction we're going into. Like, what does it look like? How can you get it? You know, the truth is, in the end, many attacks look very, very similar. I mean, there's the reason the kill chain, the attack chain, or any of those differences are showing you, this was my recon. Maybe you won't be able to see the recon. Maybe the recon was Jeannie was standing in line behind an expensive hotel and the woman read off the password to the woman in front of me. Did I have to pay for it? I did not. Am I a bad person? A little. So all of these different pieces, there are always going to be ways of like, what is the initial recon to get me in through the door? The comfort we all have is there are certain things that happen along the ways. Is how do I get to something of higher value? How do I see my lateral movement? How do I see privilege estimation? How do I see, I love that endpoint EDR now has, you can see, hey, what's the first time a process started up on Jeannie's laptop that's never started before? And the bad guys have gotten super clever. They are no longer naming their new accounts Killjoy and Bad Guy and any of that. Now they're naming themselves something very innocuous, like, you know, Admin 6 or different pieces that make them say, no, no, I truly belong here. The truth is, whatever the evidence is, it might change in name, but the chains are going to remain. Nobody's found a new way to jump straight to here. And if they do, and if they get something new, we're still going to start seeing similar behavior across the road. So it should be comforting. I'm trying to be comforting here. Jason, was it comforting for you in a SOC that sooner or later, if they pinpoint something new in my environment, there's still going to be behavior I recognize?
Yeah, so a good example that we actually found with our red team. Unfortunately, Salesforce was wide open, and when customers would submit a ticket, there would either be a link or an attachment. And as y'all knows, the customer service side likes to click on anything that comes in a ticket or open it. And unfortunately, certain things are not. Back in the day, 3 or 4 years ago, EDR wasn't as big. So basically they were being social engineered to get in and have these customer reps, which had access to, like you said, service accounts that shouldn't have been, enabled to do lateral movement. Luckily, we found that out quickly and kind of nipped that in the butt.
Exactly. Take us to the next slide, Tim. This was an example of a service account that said, we care about the first times. First times are sus. New events are sus. My laptop has a new process that's whatever the name happens to be. That's what's sus. And this is an example that we use to say, if somebody in the SOC sees this, they immediately ought to say, something is strange. This is a service account. This is not a human being behind it. This is normally a connection. Maybe it's on an API. Maybe it's a service. Maybe it's an application. These are different ways of saying that, this would be something that if my red team did something to compromise I've compromised the website, I've got an account. This is what a SOC or an MSSP should be able to see. So I might say, I don't know that but this is a service account. So if it is compromised, there's a human here. Somebody's doing something. So hopefully then you'll be able to train your SOC to say, I found it faster, or your MSSP team to say, I do monitor for service accounts. I do care that maybe I've got an IBMX server that's got 100 different websites on it. I want to be able to see what each of those service accounts does when they do something that is not behaving like a machine. Take us to another example. This is where you start saying it's kind of useful to have that human element and chat with HR to say, have they been compromised or are they leaving? My first one is I say, Sherry Lee, poor Sherry, we're going to throw her a retirement party. She's a sales team. I do not think my sales team has it in them to set up a Tor network. I would be shocked if she knew how to set herself up as a Tor endpoint. I am betting that Sherry did clicked, moved, went somewhere unprotected, connected to airport Wi-Fi without using her VPN. I think something happened here. And maybe I can go back to figure out where it is, but where we see something happening, this is where any kind of UEBA helps you understand and see this is a first time, this is something that somebody shouldn't know how to do or doesn't. It might be different if I saw this on Steve's system put in. Is like, okay, I would say that Steve knows how to use the Tor network, but this might be worth my phone call of saying, hey, Steve, are you running a red team exercise right now? What are you doing with this? Are you trying to get data? Are you gathering some research for your team? But at the moment, what I did successfully is I said, I've seen it. I've escalated it. I've investigated it. I am now investigating it. So my mean time to respond, and respond is the see something, say something. That's what we can measure, right? How quickly do we bug somebody and say that you haven't done it? Mike, is your team running something today that you didn't tell us about? And he should smile in a smug, pleased sort of way that says, yeah, we are. And the good news about it is when you've set up, your first one might be rocky. I don't know if you guys have any first time we did this stories that you want to share with them. First time you ran a red team exercise, how long did it go before somebody said, hey, Mike, what are you doing?
My story is we made everything notable essentially in our advanced analytics instance of Exabeam, our first go around, which is fine. In my opinion, it was fine. I mean, it showed that the system was working well. It lit everything up. Granted, it did create a slew of incidents in our case management system, which was ServiceNow at the time. So that was fun to work with our admin team to like clear them all out and mass assign status is saying, normal testing, just benign, let it be. But
yeah. Well, I think we're at the top of the hour, so I want to wrap up and round the horn. Steve, did you want to go first? Anything that you wanted to say before you run off to your next meeting? I'm
already considered late for it because it's on the hour now. But no, this has been a great discussion. Thanks everybody for attending. Jeannie, thanks for hosting. Hopefully this has been helpful in highlighting kind of some of the pros and cons, risks and rewards around red teaming, blue teaming, purple teaming, and we're certainly available for follow-up if anybody has any additional questions.